Thank you, Sarah and Rusty. That was beautiful. Well, this has been fun. Thank you to everybody who has borne with us through this and many other exciting adventures in worship. Today is the last of 6 Sundays that I have spent reflecting on the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism's living tradition. And today we are focused on how that tradition is shaped by Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Well, Unitarians and Universalists were both liberal Christian denominations before the merger into Unitarian Universalism in 1961. So that's one answer. That's an easy answer about how this tradition has been shaped by those traditions. But of all our sources, this is the one with the deepest theological historical roots, right? These are our parents and grandparents, if you will, as a denomination. And until fairly recently, 1961, and even then, the dominant tradition that we drew from. And we'll get back to that modern moment in a moment by the end of this, I promise. But I wanted to start way back in history for one of the most important, central, maybe even essential, dare I say it, Unitarian Universalist practices is found in that history. Science fiction writer and Christian author Madeleine L'Engle wrote, "Jesus was not a theologian. Jesus was a God who told stories." And I absolutely love that description. The Jewish and Christian stories, condensed, distilled, and painted in a broad brush, because we're not going to get thousands and thousands and thousands of years of history into what needs to be like a 5-minute sermon now, is about covenant at its heart. Without covenant, there would be no Judaism, no Christianity, no Unitarian Universalism. Bold statement. When we go back to the very, very beginning, we go back to the stories of Genesis, the stories from the Torah that form the mythology and history that roots the Jewish people in their relationship with God and in their relationship with all of creation. We go way back, we look at Adam and Eve. The first moment of dramatic tension in our narrative, the English literature professor comes out. Dramatic tension when God is faced with their first disobedience. When Adam and Eve are discovered and God pronounces a curse upon them, what if we saw this not as a pronouncement of a all-knowing deity, but as God and God's creation having their first fight? The first fight in any new relationship is always very tense, isn't it? The God described in the Garden of Eden is one that is very anthropomorphized, very present, walks in the garden physically, talks directly to God's creations, and even makes mistakes. In this scene, God is realizing that just exactly what it meant to create humanity in their image. It is no surprise that humans wanted to be as God was. One of the ways to see these stories, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of Noah, and then later the story of Abraham and of David, is not about us discovering God, but as God discovering us. We were the new ones, after all. These are the stories about how the Hebrew people see God, but also stories about how they believe God sees God's creation. In this primeval history, we see a God who makes errors, a God who gives up on virtually all of creation, and a God that is inscrutable, that doesn't quite make sense. Indeed, it is as God becomes more godlike in that sense that paradise becomes threatened. These are the stories of God learning to be in relationship with something new. God never had to be in a relationship with another being with free will in this narrative. God is still learning us, even as we are still learning God. I love to think about God in the Moses story as just scratching their head and just getting frustrated and doing that creative thing that I think every maker person has wanted to do, where they just swipe everything off the table, right? Well, we all wanted to do that at one point or another, papers or clay or art, paint, whatever it is. And then I think about God watching Moses do this ridiculous thing, this boat building, and this faithfulness to those commandments, and going, wow, maybe there's something to these humans after all. Perhaps I should not do this again. Perhaps I should not wipe the map again. Perhaps I made a mistake. Perhaps I have something I need to learn. And at the end of this story, God makes a promise to all of humanity that says, I'm never going to do this again. And here's a rainbow, and now we have rainbows, and that's great. But we also have a promise from God that I can make mistakes, and I can learn from them. There are two kinds of covenants in the Old Testament. There are many, many, many covenants other than the ones that I have mentioned here briefly or in detail. But they fall into two categories. One is, there are terms for these I discovered in preparation this week, a suzerain vassal covenant, which harkens back to a time when kings would make promises to their subjects or treaties between kings that are dependent on obedience to specific terms, right? This is sort of a covenant as a conditional promise. And there are certainly examples of those covenants in Hebrew scriptures. Tells David and Abraham before him, I will give you a land, I will make your people blessed if you follow my law. But then we also have covenants like the one made with Noah, which are called a royal grant. Apparently these are going to be some kingly terms here. And a royal grant requires no action on the part of the beneficiary. It's unconditional and given from one person to another. Covenant is a living thing. And as Octavia Butler reminded us a couple weeks ago, God is change. These are things that change and are shaped over time. Very, very brief version of a story from John S. Donne, who's a Catholic theologian. And the story tells about man going to seek wisdom to find God on the top of a mountain. So man climbs the mountain to try and get to God. But at the same time, God is climbing down the other side of the mountain to get to humanity. And I love this story because we like to think of our spiritual journey as going up to the mountain to vision, clarity, purpose, insight, wisdom, perspective, all of these wonderful things. But when we get up there, we realize that that's not actually where God is. God is down among the messy, complicated human beings that he has grown to love in relationship over the years. These covenants are a story of God and humanity learning to be together, making mistakes, making amends, trying again, trying something different. And we discovered that a covenant is not a rule, it is a promise. It grows and changes, encompasses new realities. And instead of a law, ultimately, God decided to try a covenant as a living thing. So God became a living thing in the form of humankind in the story of Jesus in order to better understand. That is God coming down from the mountain. So let's fast forward from the time of Jesus as a living embodiment of human vulnerability. Hundreds of years later, thousands almost years later, in the 1630s, about 20,000 English Puritans settled in New England and established independent parishes or neighborhood churches. And they practiced congregational polity, which is the form of church governance that we practice, that we will be practicing actively today at a congregational meeting. And so these churches were governed and united on an equal footing, not by assent to a particular creed, but entering into covenant by signing a promise together. In 1894, the Unitarian Church of Evanston, Illinois, adopted this covenant, written by its minister, Reverend James Vila Blake. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another, which sounds pretty familiar to me. The free church tradition of which we are a part does not offer up a creed, a certain set of beliefs that everyone must accept in order to belong. Instead, the boundaries of our community are determined by commitment and by participation. Our question is not what do we believe, but what values will we uphold, and how will we do it together? There is no life apart from life together. We believe that religious community exists to move people towards a way of life that our society sorely needs, one that moves away from violence and practices justice and compassion, that moves from going it alone to giving and receiving care from others, that takes us out of our isolated selves into sharing work on behalf of a common good. Our life's purpose is supported and amplified by a community devoted to loving this world enough to save it.